In a significant development that underscores the widening scope of U.S. involvement in Venezuela's political and economic turmoil, American forces have seized another oil tanker linked to the embattled South American nation. Officials say the action was taken ahead of a scheduled meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado, as Washington continues efforts to control Venezuelan oil assets amid an ongoing crisis that has shaken global energy markets and international diplomacy. The vessel, identified by U.S. authorities as the Veronica, was intercepted in the Caribbean Sea in what military officials described as a coordinated maritime interdiction operation. According to a statement from U.S. Southern Command, Marines and sailors launched from the aircraft carrier USS Gerald R. Ford, joined by a tactical United States Coast Guard boarding team, successfully took control of the ship without incident. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem characterized the seizure as part of an enforcement of sanctions and quarantine measures aimed at preventing sanctioned oil tankers from entering or leaving Venezuelan waters. Noem said that the Veronica had operated in defiance of a Caribbean quarantine established by the Trump administration, which has sought to curtail sanctioned oil shipments and disrupt illicit sales linked to the Venezuelan oil sector. This marks at least the sixth tanker seizure in recent weeks as part of a broader campaign that Washington has undertaken to assert control over Venezuela's oil exports and influence the country's strategic resources. Previous interdictions have included vessels reportedly evading sanctions by sailing under false flags or disguised registries, tactics often used by what analysts call a shadow fleet of tankers that attempt to circumvent U.S. maritime restrictions. Officials say the recent operations reflect a continuation of what has been termed Operation Southern Spear, a multi-agency initiative involving the U.S. military, the Coast Guard, the Departments of Homeland Security and Justice, and intelligence agencies all working to enforce sanctions, counter illicit oil transport, and disrupt financial networks tied to Venezuelan state revenues. The seizure comes amid a larger backdrop of U.S. policy toward Venezuela, which has shifted dramatically since late 2025. In December, Washington began enforcing an effective maritime blockade on vessels carrying Venezuelan crude that fall under sanction lists, and military assets in the Caribbean were deployed to interdict ships suspected of violating these measures. Some of these interdictions have drawn international attention, including the high-profile capture of tankers flying dubious flags or operating under opaque ownership structures. According to government sources cited in court filings and statements to journalists, dozens of warrants have been filed in U.S. federal courts seeking the forfeiture of additional vessels believed to be involved in transporting Venezuelan crude without authorization, as part of the legal framework to justify seizure under U.S. sanctions laws. This latest operation occurred just days before President Trump's scheduled meeting at the White House with Maria Corina Machado, a prominent opposition figure and Nobel laureate who has been welcomed by U.S. lawmakers and administrations as a voice of democratic reform in Venezuela. The timing of the tanker seizure ahead of the meeting underscores how Washington is tying its diplomatic outreach to the broader strategy of exerting pressure on Venezuelan economic structures. In Washington, administration officials have defended the seizures as necessary to enforce U.S. law and uphold international sanctions, asserting that sanctioned tankers undermine both American national interests and efforts to reshape the Venezuelan petroleum sector. Homeland Security and Pentagon spokespeople have said the Navy and Coast Guard will continue monitoring sanctioned vessels throughout the region and will act to interdict those attempting to slip past blockades or misrepresent their registries. At the same time, critics of the policy have raised questions about the legal basis for such maritime operations, especially as they occur in international waters far from the sovereign territorial sea of the United States. Some lawmakers and international legal scholars argue that unilateral interdictions on the high seas could set complex precedents in maritime law and raise tensions with other nations whose flagged vessels might be targeted under similar interpretations of sanctions enforcement. The broader geopolitical response has been mixed. Russia, whose interests are closely aligned with Venezuela, has condemned previous tanker seizures as unlawful acts of maritime piracy and aggression, drawing rebukes from Moscow that these operations violate principles of international navigation and vessel sovereignty. Other countries, especially those in the Caribbean and Latin America, have watched the evolving situation with concern as U.S. actions alter long-standing norms of oil trade and maritime conduct. But within Caracas and among interim Venezuelan leaders aligned with Washington's opposition support, the interdictions are portrayed as part of a broader effort to weaken the influence of the Maduro regime and reframe Venezuela's economic future. These leaders argue that controlling the export and sale of oil, traditionally the lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy, is essential to curtailing corruption and redirecting revenue toward reconstruction and development. Despite these assertions, questions remain about the long-term implications of such seizures for global oil markets, international relations, and the stability of shipping lanes in the Caribbean. Venezuela's crude resources represent a significant share of global reserves, and any disruption to the flow of its oil, whether through sanctioned interdictions or broader blockades, has the potential to impact prices and supply chains, particularly for refiners dependent on heavy crude grades. Even as the Trump administration defends its actions as enforcement of sanctions and protection of national interests, international bodies such as the United Nations have seen pushback from nations advocating for the rule of law and respect for maritime treaties. Some legal analysts have highlighted that any extended interdiction regime could prompt diplomatic disputes over jurisdiction, flag state rights, and the authority of one state to enforce sanctions against global shipping interests. The seizure of the Veronica tank and other vessels before it thus reflects not only a tactical maneuver to control the flow of Venezuelan oil, but also a broader strategic posture by the United States in reshaping its role in Latin America. Whether these actions will yield lasting economic and political outcomes in Venezuela, or instead provoke unintended diplomatic backlash, remains a subject of intense debate among policymakers, analysts, and international jurists alike. International reaction to the latest U.S. tanker seizure has been swift and divided, reflecting deep geopolitical fault lines surrounding Venezuela's political crisis and the future of its vast oil resources. While Washington has framed the operation as lawful sanctions enforcement, several foreign governments and legal experts have raised concerns over the precedent such actions may set for global maritime operations. Russia was among the first nations to criticize the seizure, with officials in Moscow accusing the United States of engaging in what they described as economic warfare and maritime coercion. Russian diplomats warned that unilateral interdictions of commercial vessels could undermine international shipping norms and threaten freedom of navigation, particularly if other countries adopt similar enforcement tactics beyond their territorial waters. China, another key stakeholder with economic ties to Venezuela, issued a more measured response, calling for restraint and urging all parties to respect international law. Chinese officials emphasized the importance of stability in global energy markets and warned that disruptions to oil transport routes could have unintended consequences for energy importing nations already facing economic uncertainty. Across Latin America, reactions have been mixed. Governments aligned with Washington's position on Venezuela expressed support for efforts to curb what they describe as illicit oil sales and corruption within the Venezuelan energy sector. Others, particularly in the Caribbean and parts of South America, have voiced unease, noting that aggressive maritime enforcement could affect regional shipping lanes and economic activity. At the center of the controversy is the legal framework underpinning the tanker seizures. U.S. officials cite domestic sanctions laws and forfeiture warrants issued by federal courts as the basis for the operations. According to the Department of Justice, vessels linked to sanctioned entities can be seized if they are engaged in transactions that violate U.S. law, even when operating outside American territorial waters, provided there is sufficient nexus to U.S. jurisdiction. However, international law experts say the issue is far from settled. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, ships on the high seas are generally subject to the exclusive jurisdiction of their flag state, except in limited circumstances such as piracy or slavery. Critics argue that extending sanctions enforcement into international waters risks blurring these legal boundaries and could invite challenges from other nations whose vessels may be affected. Supporters of the U.S. position counter that sanctions regimes increasingly rely on financial and legal mechanisms that transcend borders, particularly when vessels interact with U.S. ports, banks, or insurers. They argue that modern maritime commerce is deeply interconnected with U.S.-based systems, giving Washington leverage to enforce its laws even beyond its shores. The economic implications of the tanker seizure are also significant. Venezuela possesses the world's largest proven oil reserves, and its heavy crude remains critical for certain refineries, particularly in the United States and Asia. Analysts say repeated interdictions could further constrain Venezuela's ability to export oil, tightening supply and potentially driving up prices for heavy crude blends. Energy markets reacted cautiously to news of the latest seizure. While global oil prices did not spike dramatically, traders noted increased volatility in futures linked to heavy crude and shipping insurance. Some insurers are reportedly reassessing coverage for vessels operating in or near Venezuelan waters, a move that could raise costs and discourage shipping activity in the region. Within the United States, the tanker seizures have sparked debate among policymakers and industry leaders. Supporters of the administration argue that controlling Venezuelan oil assets is essential to preventing revenue from flowing to sanctioned actors and criminal networks. They say the strategy strengthens U.S. leverage ahead of diplomatic engagements, including the upcoming meeting between President Trump and opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. Critics, however, warn that prolonged maritime enforcement could strain relations with allies and complicate global trade. Representatives from shipping and energy companies have urged clarity on enforcement rules, saying uncertainty makes it difficult to plan investments and logistics. In Venezuela, interim authorities aligned with the opposition have welcomed U.S. actions, describing them as a step toward reclaiming national resources from corruption and mismanagement. They argue that restricting unauthorized oil exports could help stabilize the country's finances once political reforms are implemented. Still, humanitarian groups caution that any reduction in oil revenue risks worsening conditions for ordinary Venezuelans, unless accompanied by measures to protect essential imports. As Washington continues to expand its campaign of tanker seizures and asset control, the situation remains fluid. Legal challenges, diplomatic negotiations, and market responses are expected to shape the next phase of the crisis. For now, the seizure of another Venezuela-linked tanker underscores how oil, law, and geopolitics remain tightly intertwined in a conflict with consequences far beyond the Caribbean. The seizure of the Veronica tank, and other vessels before it, thus reflects not only a tactical maneuver to control the flow of Venezuelan oil, but also a broader strategic posture by the United States in reshaping its role in Latin America. Whether these actions will yield lasting economic and political outcomes in Venezuela, or instead provoke unintended diplomatic backlash, remains a subject of intense debate among policymakers, analysts, and international jurists alike.